Please take your seats slowly. Take your seats. We have an excellent third panel lined up this afternoon. And I am just going to introduce the chair at this point. The title of the panel is Paths to Democracy in the Middle East, or Which Paths to Democracy in the Middle East. It will be led by Professor Kathleen Bailey, my colleague in the Political Science Department, whose research and teaching interests lie in ethnic and regional politics, especially that of Uzbekistan and Central Asia. Professor Bailey has been teaching in Middle East politics for years, but she is also the director of our Islamic Civilizations and Societies program, and she also directs the Gabelli Presidential Scholars Program. And without further ado, I will hand the floor over to you, Kathy. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yes, okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to all your amazing staff and students for their great organizational abilities. I'm very impressed. Our charge is, for this panel, is what paths for democracy in the Middle East. And I think if we were speaking or having this discussion 14, my math is bad, is it 14 years ago? Then we might have some better answers, because that, of course, was the Arab Spring. And it seemed like the path to democracy was clear, or it was not so elusive as it may be today. And, you know, regime after regime, beginning with Tunisia, fell and got rid of their dictators, and it was really interesting for a couple of years to see maybe what was going to happen. Of course, we know how that ended, and in some cases very tragically. But I would say that talking about the region as a whole might be a little bit misleading. And so digging into each of the various states might be more instructive. And so I know that's what we're going to do today with our panelists who are going to cover a lot of territory, including Israel and Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, and the Gulf monarchies. And so let me start by introducing them. I'm delighted to introduce my colleague in the political science program and also a faculty associate in the Islamic Civilization and Societies program, Marsin Alshamary, who's assistant professor and scholar of Middle East politics with a primary focus on religious institutions, civil society, and protest movements. She's currently working on a book manuscript titled A Century of the Iraqi Hossa, How Clerics Shaped Protests and Politics in Modern-Day Iraq, which explores the historical and contemporary interactions between the Shia religious establishment and protest movements. She has many articles under her belt and many media appearances, and she has also consulted for organizations such as the UN, the World Bank, and I have to say it, USAID. And the second panelist is also my colleague in the political science department and a faculty associate for the Islamic Civilization and Societies program, as well as international studies. Peter Krause's research and teaching focus on international security, Middle East politics, terrorism and political violence, nationalism, rebels, and revolution. He's the author of Rebel Power, Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win, and co-editor of Coercion, The Power to Hurt in International Politics, and Stories from the Field, A Guide to Navigating Fieldwork in Political Science. He's published many articles on the causes and effectiveness of terrorism and political violence, why states negotiate with ethno-political organizations, the strategies of counter-secession, social movements, and territorial control in Israel, U.S. intervention in the Syrian civil war, and the politics of division within the Palestinian national movement. He has extensive field work experience in the Middle East, and I'm just thrilled to be on the panel with both of them. So who wants to start?
All right, we can start from west to
Okay, let's do that. Thank you. Sure. Can we- Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. So Peter and I have a lot of ground to cover, so we're going from the east, Iraq, all the way to the west, towards Palestine and Israel. So I will very quickly cover Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria today, and particularly with a focus on prospects for democratization and key challenges. I wanted to start off by saying that in my last class on Thursday, we were reading George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, and one of the key themes that emerged was our use of words without really much substance or without much thinking about what we actually mean when we say them. And my students were really fixated on the use of democracy as something that's just a good without really questioning why it's a good. And so I want to clarify that when I talk about democracy in the Middle East, I don't necessarily mean a political system that will be liked by the United States or that would be even something that people in the US would find familiar or acceptable, but rather a system characterized by representation, inclusivity, and political competition of people in the region that's open and free to them, that might use elections and other mechanisms, and that results in policies that serve the best interests of the citizens of that country as perceived by them to be their best interests. So what I'm trying to say is for people in the US, democracy probably in the Middle East might not mean, the best, most strongest alliance with the US or with Israel, for example. It also might not mean that there is recognition of certain countries in the Middle East, like Israel, which is, I think, what really is something that premised the invasion of Iraq a lot and what people are looking at in Syria right now. But for the people in the Middle East, what I also want to highlight is that democracy, and we've learned this from the Arab Spring, doesn't mean immediate economic prosperity either. And that's something really important for people to recognize in the region. So democracy is something that we've talked about a lot today, but I just wanted to put the caveat that people might want it, but then it doesn't look exactly like what they were hoping to get out of it in different contexts. Moving to Iraq really quickly. So I want to summarize where Iraq is right now and talk about whether its future looks democratic from my perspective. I will start by saying that I am Iraqi, so I feel particularly capable of presenting this part of the presentation. So as of 2025, Iraq is a federal democracy with abundant oil wealth recovering from 4 decades of violence and war. In November 2025, Iraq will hold its 6th parliamentary election since the December 2005 election following the invasion. This is 2 decades of admittedly imperfect elections, but elections nonetheless. Obviously, it could be more free and fair. There could be higher participation, a higher turnout. Iraq's last election in 2021 had a 43% turnout. That's quite low, particularly compared to 2005 when we had an 80% turnout. So it's not perfect by any means, but we have had consistent elections, which is quite an accomplishment, I would say, given what's happening in the region. With the exception of Lebanon, I would say it's one of the countries that has the highest freedom of speech in the region. So if you've been to Lebanon or Iraq, you can walk around saying pretty much almost whatever you want to say with very little consequences of that. And I will actually say right now that, genuinely speaking, I think Iraq has more freedom of speech than the United States concerning certain topics. So that's quite an accomplishment, I would say. On the other side, however, Iraq does have a consociational model, which means that it is premised on power sharing among ethno-religious groups, so it really does prioritize looking at politics through the lens of identity, which might not be a very good thing going forward. It's a useful tool for transition, but maybe not for long-term governance. Iraq is a federal state, and by that I mean, in particular, it has a semi-autonomous region for the Kurds, which is actually the best setup that the Kurds have in any country in the Middle East right now, and a key issue when we talk about Syria. And Iraq has been stable enough to hold its first census in 4 decades, which we found out the population is 45 million, a little bit over than what we thought it would be. It's very young, growing, but more importantly than what the census tells us, it's also a symbol of stability, of state capacity, and a lack of sectarian and ethnic tensions politically, because people had feared a census prior to this because it would change the power sharing structure of the country. It would increase seats in parliament. It might say that one group is bigger than another. Famously, Lebanon has not had a census since 1932, and people feared previously that Iraq would be down this path as well. But, you know, obviously I'm not entirely rosy-eyed about a lot of things, so I would say when it comes to political institutions, Iraq is doing as well as I would hope with a realistic perspective. But what really concerns me for the long term is the issue of foreign intervention and the issue of monopoly on violence. There are armed groups in Iraq, some of them are supported by outside powers, and there is always a history of foreign intervention, including, of course, the US intervention in 2003, but more recently, intervention from Turkey in the sense of military bases in northern Iraq, and obviously Iran having support for armed groups in the country. So it's not an entirely super rosy account, but I would say looking comparatively across the region, it's doing okay, and the prospects for continued democratization should be ensured so long as there isn't a lot of pushback on the country. Syria, on the other hand, is pretty much 20 years behind where Iraq is today, which is a really exciting opportunity for Syrians, and there's lots of opportunities to learn from the Iraqi case. However, I do want to stress that Syria has lived through 6 decades of authoritarianism and is building democratic institutions, hopefully, from the ground up, with very little prior experience or knowledge on how they function. It had gone from colonialism to basically military coups to the Ba'athist regime that has been totalitarian and extremely authoritarian for decades. Syria right now has had a series of events that seem to signal where the government might be going. So as of a few days ago, on March 18th, we've had 100 days of the new Syrian government. And in these 100 days, we've had the Victory Conference, which was the earliest conference to set where the country was going back in January. And it set a 3 to 4, 5-year period of transition. Most importantly, it created a presidency position and installed Ahmed al-Shara, who some of you who follow armed groups in the region might know previously as a member of Al-Qaeda and a leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra at various points. So obviously he raises alarms for anyone who knows the region because he comes from a background of sectarian violence in Iraq, a lot of violence in the Syrian civil war, and a deeply conservative and Islamist background with a lot of ties to foreign fighters, and a lot of issues that are concerning in that sense. Along with him becoming president, there was also the dissolution of the Ba'ath Party in Syria, the Syrian army, which will create a security vacuum, and the Syrian parliament. Following this, we've also had the National Dialogue Conference in Syria in February, and it kind of builds up on it, but really excludes the armed groups. And this is more of an accumulation of like civil society energy. And I'll pause here to say that even as Syria is building from what I said is the ground up, the last 13 years of the civil war has actually allowed it to cultivate a civil society that is genuine and strong and very experienced in a way that I would say other countries in the Middle East haven't had a chance. And we were joking about US aid, but one of the things I tell Syrians is that it may seem really daunting to have to build institutions without the support of US money or European money, but actually it's also a blessing in disguise because it teaches you to be resilient and to find indigenous forms of funding, and to be able to push the agenda you want rather than the agenda imposed by outside powers. The key issue left from these conferences, of course, is that there are still various armed groups in the region that haven't really figured out their position in Syria. Key among them, of course, are the Kurds that are supported by the US in the northeast, so the SDF here. And famously, they reached a deal with the Syrian government about coming together and forming a centralized government with a unified army in March, so a few days ago. But anyone who follows the region close enough knows that it's a lot easier to agree to having to letting go of your arms and forming a unity in armies or in security infrastructure, but it really might not be what happens on the ground. That it's actually really hard to get people to put down their weapons. They might nominally agree to it, but they probably would not give up something that they had worked for and maintained for 13 years. And critically, it's the Kurds in Syria who are also responsible for managing the El Hol camp, which is the biggest camp of ISIS affiliates and then people who were displaced because of ISIS, and it's considered what I've heard various UN people in Iraq refer to it as a ticking time bomb that might create a crisis of extreme instability and violence in the region. So they're critically important for that. Syria has also had an instance of extreme violence on the coast because of an Assad era or Assadist insurgency. So Assadist loyalists mounted an insurgency, and in response to that, there was a very brutal massacre of minorities along the Syrian coast. And that was really seen as a problem that immediately highlighted the inability of Shah to really control the various armed groups that he had brought under his umbrella, and particularly their proclivity to exact violence on minorities that they think have a relationship with Assad. And very, very recently, we've seen an interim constitution also issued in Syria. And the key things to take away from this interim constitution is that Syria does not want to be like Iraq or Lebanon. It does not want a consociational system. It does not want to have power sharing, and it does not want quotas. They view themselves as a very centralized state. And this constitution also gives the president exceptional powers. So the president appoints a third of the parliament, etc. But there is a 5-year framework where this constitution will make way to a new one. So it is very much a temporary one. Of interest to people, perhaps, is the fact that in this constitutional framework, there is mention that the source of legislation for Syria's laws right now is Islamic jurisprudence, which is it is also referred to as the main source rather than or the only source rather than one of the many sources. So this, of course, raised a lot of alarm bells for people who were concerned about Ahmed al-Shara's past as the leader of an Islamist armed group. And I will say that he's very much trying to change his image. There was a podcast that you might be interested in listening to, which was translated into English. I forget the exact name, but if you find me later, I can send it to you. But he's being interviewed by 2 British guys. One of them was in Iraq in 2003. And the way he describes his time in Iraq as part of Al-Qaeda is almost like he was there for tourism. It was like I was interested in learning about war. But, I was 18. So he's trying to change his image. And, this will, might be swallowed by some people, but not by others. But I really do want to say that a lot of places just require time and stability for any real structures of governance to emerge, and perhaps to be patient with Syria. In the very little time I have left, I quickly want to talk about Lebanon. So Lebanon has just emerged from a really brutal war with Israel. The damages are estimated to be $8 to $9 billion. And keep in mind that Lebanon has also just emerged from a financial crisis, so it doesn't have the money to reconstruct the country. It's also just emerged from a 2-year-long constitutional crisis in which it didn't have anything but an interim government. It now has a president and a prime minister, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about both of them in the international community. They're saying things like they want to make sure the ceasefire is implemented with Israel, that they're wanting to have a control on the tools of violence in the country. So in other words, really sidelining Hezbollah and Amal, the Shia armed groups and the Shia political parties in the region, in the country. So a lot of enthusiasm for what they're saying, but one of the cautionary things that I do want to lay out about Lebanon is that they are behaving in a way that they had behaved prior to the Lebanese civil war, in that there is a very much Western-supported set of politicians that everyone is very excited about. However, they seem to act as though the Shia majority, which we know from a lot of data in Lebanon, seem to not have a voice, or that they will just fall in line behind anything that the new leaders of Lebanon want. And this, to me, sends some concerns, or speaks to some concerns about potentially having civil conflict in Lebanon going forward, because there seems to be like one group of society pushing the country in one direction, almost obliviously to another group in society that has just suffered a war and is trying to recover from it. So that being said, I always remind people that Lebanon has had elections prior to any other country in the Middle East, so it does have a long history of democratic institutions, and Lebanon was a pioneer of power sharing and consociationalism. And back when Syria was having a very difficult time pulling a country together post-colonialism, Lebanese people actually had a very good idea of how they wanted to divide power among the different groups. So I'm always an optimistic person, but I do just want to highlight that there has to be a period of transition for countries, and you can't really expect democracy to emerge even 13 or 14 years after the Arab Spring. That's hardly anything in the history of politics, right? It could take 4 decades for anything really powerful to emerge. All right, thank you. I actually managed to cover 3 countries.
All right. Thank you so much to Jonathan and to the Clough Center for inviting me to this conference. Honestly, times like this, I think, are why the Clough Center is most needed, and so it's really wonderful to have this, even though the region that we're focusing on right now, as Marsin said, is in somewhat of a dark time regarding the future of democracy, which I'm going to talk a bit about. So, as we have seen in the news in the past few days, the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is over, and airstrikes and rockets are again the order of the day in Gaza and Israel. October 7th was the deadliest day for the Jewish and Israeli people since the Holocaust, and the year and a half since has been the deadliest for the Palestinians in their modern history. Now, naturally, our collective focus has been on the dead, on the hostages, on the displaced, in this brutal conflict that is seemingly without end. I wish I could give you better news about the focus of this conference, which is the state of democracy for Israelis and Palestinians, but unfortunately, I largely cannot. To be honest, Israeli and Palestinian democracy are arguably at their lowest and most vulnerable points in our lifetimes. Let me start with Israel. Before the current war, the issue that drove hundreds of thousands to the streets was indeed the future of Israel's democracy, with Prime Minister Netanyahu aiming to limit judicial review of Knesset legislation and change how Supreme Court justices were selected, giving the Prime Minister and his coalition more control. The significant polarization in Israeli society was evident from the fact that the country set a record with 5 elections in 4 years between 2019 and 2022, in part because no coalition could form a stable majority. Now, on the one hand, this could be seen as a success of Israeli democracy, because all of these were free and fair elections, they were contested in what was generally a free press, and these elections were held among far more viable parties than there are in the United States. In Israel, you have parties representing left, right, and center, secular and religious, Jewish and Arab. That said, Arab Israelis, or Palestinian citizens of Israel, as some identify, vote at a lower percentage than the Jewish majority, in part because they feel disenfranchised by a government that provides their communities with less funding and support, and which recently passed a basic law in which the nation state of Israel is only the nation state of the Jewish people, not of its other citizens. Israel's freedom ratings with Freedom House and other monitors of democracy have declined in recent years. In fact, in 2003, during the height of the Second Intifada, an incredibly brutal and violent period, the Israel Democracy Institute found that across the board for Israelis in terms of faith of their democratic institutions, it was at 59% belief and trust. 2 decades later, it sits at 34%, which is the lowest on record for the Israel Democracy Institute. This brings us back to the present conflict for Israelis, both externally with Hamas and internally for the future of Israeli democracy. When done right, democracy serves its people, especially in times of crisis. Leaders protect their citizens and promote their well-being, and they are accountable to the people's will and interests. Unfortunately, there have been a number of areas in which Israel's government has fallen short. In the aftermath of prior intelligence disasters like October 7th, there has been an official independent state commission of inquiry with subpoena power. These state commissions of inquiry are among the most trusted institutions in Israel for the Israeli people and designed to serve them. In fact, the event that predated October 7th, 2023, October 6th, 1973, when you had the Yom Kippur War, a surprise attack launched by Egypt and Syria, there was a state commission of inquiry in Israel the next month, November 1973. We sit here today 17 months after October 7th, 2023, and there has as yet been no state commission of inquiry for October 7th. Now, this is also despite the fact that both the IDF and the Shin Bet, Israel's internal intelligence services, have conducted their own internal investigations about October 7th, and their leaders have taken responsibility for their failures. One of them has been replaced, one is now in the process of being replaced. Even if he's not directly fired by Netanyahu, he's going to be gone and said he's going to be gone a couple weeks from now. It's important to note that beyond the heads of the Shin Bet and the IDF, if anyone has responsibility for Israel's policy with Hamas, it would be the leader who has been in office for most of the past 2 decades, who has more of a hand in Israel's policy with Gaza and Hamas than any other, who himself helped to facilitate the funds transferred from Qatar to Hamas, who argued that Israel should actually somewhat support Hamas while marginalizing the PA, even though Hamas aims to destroy Israel and the PA recognizes Israel and wants to cooperate with it. So ultimately, when we think about the future of Israeli democracy, we need to think not just about free and fair elections, free press, which I think Israel has in a decent amount these days, but also other institutions of trust, whether it's commissions of inquiry, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the balance of powers and checks and balances inside the government, which today, if you look on the streets of Israel, seem to be under threat. What about the Palestinians? The Palestinians did not have significant democratic institutions and regular elections in the early years of their movement, but in recent years, at least the past 30, 40 years, they have. There have been 2 national elections for the Palestinians in 1996 and in 2005, 2006. The problem, of course, is there have not been national elections for the Palestinians since then, over the past 20 years. Why? Generally because politicians don't like to have elections if they think they're going to lose them and if they have the capability to prevent them from happening. This is largely the case with Mahmoud Abbas or Abu Mazen, who reads the polls and recognizes that he has about a 10% approval rating. The Palestinian Authority writ large has maybe about a 10 to 20% approval rating among Palestinian citizens. And so ultimately, when it comes time to hold an election, even when deals are reached with Hamas or with the Israelis to have them, they find reasons to not actually hold them, in part because he would probably be voted out of office. And so the challenge for the Palestinians is that they don't really have accountability for their leaders. In terms of a free press, a lot of that is actually suppressed by Abbas and the PA. You're allowed as Palestinians to protest against the Israelis, but many of the PA are worried that those protests turn into protests against the PA itself, and so there's great concern about allowing free protest in places like around the Manara and Ramallah. There's also a lack of real checks and balances within the PA, where the Palestinian Authority president has a legislature, but most of what he says in terms of PA policy goes. And even though you poll Palestinians and you find 85 to 90% of all Palestinians want elections, they want them soon, over 70% of Palestinians don't expect them to happen anytime soon. So you have a situation where the will of the people is not being respected, where people want elections, but they also feel like they're not going to happen because of a corrupt leadership they don't believe in, and because of the fact that whether it's the Israelis, whether it's Palestinian leadership or others, they're not allowing their democratic elections to occur. What this leads to, I believe, both for Palestinians and for Israelis, is a loss of a generational shift in leadership, where you've had pretty much the same person, Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu, leading Palestinians and Israelis for 2 decades. And if you ask Israelis and Palestinians today, are you safer than you were 20 years ago? Do you feel politically represented as well as you did 20 years ago? I'm not sure if you would have positive statements to be made there on either party. So again, some negative things there to be said about the state of Israeli and Palestinian democracy today. But I'll say this, it's a lot easier to stand up here and make despair convincing as opposed to making hope practical when it comes to democracy in the Middle East and particularly for Israelis and Palestinians. So I want to make a challenge to my co-panelists, to Professor Alshamary, to Professor Bailey, to Minister Shahid, to Mr. McGurk, who's going to speak later. I look forward to it, as well as to myself, which is, can we do things that make not just despair convincing, but make hope practical regarding democracy in the Middle East? So I don't ever lay down a challenge I want to take on myself. So I want to close with 2 points that I think give us some hope for Palestinian and Israeli democracy. The first comes from scholarship, which is, if you look in political science and if you look at when leadership change happens, one of the most common times is after war. So as brutal as this conflict is today, that we all hope one way or another finds its end soon, we are likely to see, or at least more likely to see, leadership change both among Israelis and Palestinians in the aftermath of this conflict. And to the extent that we have not had generational shift or had not had fresh ideas for quite a while in either community, that's potentially something to look forward to. Secondly, I work over the summers with brave and brilliant Palestinians and Israelis in a couple of different person-to-person peace-building organizations. One is called Middle East Entrepreneurs of Tomorrow. One is called Our Generation Speaks. The biggest things I want to say from those experiences is this: do not let anyone ever tell you that there is not a partner for peace in the other community, because I work with hundreds of them every summer. Don't let anyone ever tell you that there are not Israelis who are proud or Palestinians who are proud, who are willing to humanize people in the other community and work with them to strengthen democratic values and strengthen ultimately peace between those societies. They are there. The challenge is that the generational leadership that we have in both societies is a couple ahead of the people that I'm seeing that have both fresh ideas and the ability, even if this terrible environment we're in now, to engage across community, reach out, and try to find a better outcome than what we have today. So again, if I'm looking forward to not just the terrible situation we're living in, but also the hope for the future for Israeli-Palestinian democracy, those are at least two bright spots I'm happy to talk about. So thank you very much.
So we actually have a mystery panelist, and Jonathan will introduce him in a minute, but I wanted to bring up one last case study very, very quickly, because I think it's interesting and telling. And it links into Jonathan's comments in his introduction, and you'll see why in a minute. So this is the case of Kuwait. Kuwait is not a democracy. It's not an absolute monarchy. It is something hybrid. Its parliament is elected in free and fair elections. There is debate in the National Assembly that's very lively. I've sat in on many, many, many of those sessions. And MPs really do represent their constituencies, and they have the authority to interpolate the cabinet ministers, including members of the ruling family. And they actually call this grilling, and let me tell you, it's grilling. They really lay them out on the grill, and they are not punished for doing so. It's part and parcel of the political system. After every parliamentary session, MPs answer questions from the press. They make the rounds to the diwaniyas, or the social places, and they meet with people in their district as they run for office and in between elections. But Parliament also had a reputation for gridlock. Kuwaitis looked at Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha, and these states, of course, are unhindered by representative bodies. And they saw in those places economic growth and progress and development that quickly surpassed Kuwait, which had been the most progressive and held the leadership role in the region for many years, until about 25 years ago when they were surpassed. Frustrated by the never-ending discussions that took place in Parliament, Arab Barometer reported that 66% of Kuwaitis, this was just last year, think that the parliament slows down the government and holds it back. 50% agreed that democratic regimes in general are indecisive and economic performance is weak. So last year, in May, almost a year ago, the new emir suspended parliament and parts of the 1962 progressive constitution, and he suspended parliament for 4 years. This is illegal, it's unconstitutional. The emir does have the right to suspend parliament, but he has to call elections within 60 days, and that, of course, hasn't happened. I was there when the emir gave his speech on TV announcing the suspension of parliament and changes that he will make in the constitution, and I have to say that everybody shrugged. There was almost no reaction. It was at least subdued. There were no protests. There was very little written about it in the press, and even my Kuwaiti friends didn't say very much about it. They just sighed. And that was a little depressing to me. When the emir suspended parliament, he promised to appoint a committee. In his speech, he said this, to propose constitutional amendments within 6 months. That hasn't happened. And then, of course, many Kuwaitis expected that Kuwait was going to develop with this new centralized system of technocrats, and the development was going to somehow very quickly surpass Dubai, and of course that hasn't happened either. What has happened in the past 10 months is the emir centralized and consolidated his power, even over other members of the ruling family, and the government withdrew citizenship withdrew citizenship from over 40,000 people, including women. The vast majority were women who were naturalized by marriage, by marrying a Kuwaiti man. I would say that Parliament would never have allowed this to happen. So also neighboring countries in the Gulf view Kuwait's democracy with annoyance or irritation, and they wish for autocratization in Kuwait. And perhaps there was some pressure to fall into line. I don't have any evidence of that, but I do know that 6 months later, Qatar changed its parliament to only an advisory role. But, and here's my optimistic conclusion to go along with my panelists. So the fact that development hasn't happened, the fact that all of these wonderful things that were supposed to happen haven't happened with the emir completely in power, and no critical issues have really been addressed at all, no promises have been kept. The same Arab Barometer report that showed such a lack of enthusiasm for Parliament last year also reported that 85% of Kuwaitis agreed that democratic regimes have problems but are still better than any other form of government.
So one of the reasons that we can speak about democracy in the region, other than coming at the point of the barrel of a gun or as a post-colonial transition, is because of the very influential case of Tunisia, which, of course, in December of 2010 into the winter of 2011, provided an example of what the Jasmine Revolution could bring to a region that was very much in need of democratic renewal. We are very honored and fortunate to have with us a former government leader in the audience, who is the former Prime Minister of Tunisia, Dr. Youssef Chahed. This is such a pertinent conversation to his own professional and personal experience that I asked if he would make a brief comment, and he kindly agreed. To introduce him, Dr. Chahed served as Prime Minister from 2016 to 2020. He was both the youngest head of government in Tunisia's history and the longest serving since that country's democratic transition in 2011. As Prime Minister, Youssef Chahed made significant advancements in the fight against terrorism. He launched an anti-corruption campaign, and he navigated severe economic challenges. Prior to becoming Prime Minister, he was Minister of Local Affairs, but also quite critically, he helped to conceive and carry out the presidential campaign that elected Beji Caid Essebsi to the Tunisian presidency. He holds a PhD from Paris Grignon, and he has taught economics in France, and right now he is a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. We are very grateful for you being here, Mr. Prime Minister. Welcome to Boston College. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm deeply honored to be here today. Thank you for the warm welcome and for this interesting debate and about democracy. Maybe it's a good time to talk about democracy. Yeah, all those Arab barometers, yeah, they're really, except the last one, it's always like this. If you ask people in the Arab street today what's the best form of governance, maybe they're looking more for a strong man to fix the economy rather than a specific type of regime or governance. And after that, but this does not mean that they are better under a dictatorship regime. And maybe it's not only the case in the Arab world. Today, we see the rise of this combination of populism and social networks that create this perception that the people that you are electing in a democratic regime are not serving the interest of the people. And this creates kind of distrust, and this is maybe what happened in Tunisia. But then back to the Tunisian example, which I consider is full of lessons learned for many other Arabic countries, but also for any countries that would like to embark in a democratic regime. First, it is difficult to to build a democracy, including a democracy in an Arab Muslim country, because you have to deal with issues like secular state, like political Islam. We remember after the revolution of 2011, we saw the rise of political Islam movement in Tunisia, in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, in Jordan, in Yemen, in all the Arab world. You know, the Arab Spring turned to be the rise of political Islam movements. So it was difficult to manage this. It was not expected for us. So those are difficulties that we faced immediately after the revolution. There was also difficulties in relation with the international situation, the rise of terrorism, Daesh, ISIS, all the Al-Qaeda groups at that time really make it much more difficult. Tunisia as a democratic experience was attacked many times by these groups because they were not happy to see Tunisia moving to a democratic regime, for sure. So we were attacked, and this impacted the Tunisian economy, the tourism activity. When I arrived to the government, I remember in 2016, there was a travel ban from all European countries to travel to Tunisia, and this impacted our tourism industry and our foreign currency reserve, etc. So those are really planned attacks, and the rise of terrorism impacted the transition. But also, as I mentioned, representative democracies were not in a good condition worldwide, you know, and the rise of populism also, and this make it much more difficult in a country where the institutions are not strong, because it's not an old democracy like in other countries, but when the institutions are fragile, so it's much easier to go back to a dictatorship regime. So those are difficulties. But then I think we did a lot of wrong political choices, or economic and political choices. Number one was to rewrite the constitution from scratch. This took like 2.5 years, because you lose momentum. You know, people did a revolution, so they're expecting to have immediate results. And then after 3 years, we had a good constitution, but this is not an achievement. It's not enough for the population. And by the way, the current president used the same constitution that we were happy with, because it was a democratic constitution. He used an article of this constitution to turn it to a dictatorship regime. So a constitution doesn't, it is the way how political actors use this constitution and behave with this constitution. So I think we did some wrong political choices, including in the beginning, immediately after the revolution. As I mentioned, the political system that we choose, we usually, after so many years of dictatorship, we choose the political system that is at the opposite of the centralization of power. So we created a lot of institutions to manage the election, to manage the transitional justice, to manage the media, to manage, and we gave 100% independence to the justice. So the Minister of Justice has no relation with the judge. He cannot appoint them. He cannot remove them. But we ended with a system that we don't know who is governing the country. We dispersed the powers, because the philosophy that we wrote the Constitution with was something like avoiding the concentration of power to avoid the repetition of the dictatorship. But this ended with a system that is a blackmailing system. I give you an example. When I was prime minister, for example, if I have to appoint a minister, I can do that. But then if I want to change this minister, I have to go to the parliament to get approval. So then I am under the political party's approval, and then maybe you have to choose someone who can get the approval from the parliament and not the best skilled person for that job, you know. So we choose a political system that was not really adapted for the country. It required a lot of consensus, and you know, we were not used with that. Especially that the political class that you have after a dictatorship regime is a political class that is not used to run a country. The people that were confronting a dictator are courageous people, but they don't have any vision for the country. They are here to confront and to fight for human rights, etc. But then, when it turned to run a country, it is something different. You need to run a ministry, or you need a vision, you need a leadership, you need a governance. So the political class, that this is the problem with dictatorship regime, and we see that with Syria. we end up with the Shara, who is the former Al-Qaeda, who is former, fighters, etc. So I don't know what is the Syrian political class, but then, because Bashar al-Assad prevented everyone there was no political life, so you don't find a political class that is able to conduct this transition to democracy. And then we did a lot of political mistake immediately after the revolution. Another failure in Tunisia, and I think this is an important for Syria, it is about transitional justice. We failed in Tunisia in the transitional justice. So all those people that worked with the old regime, how you treat them? They are not all corrupted. Many of them were just instructed by the dictator to do things, but then many of them are skilled. And the people that come after the revolution, they were not skilled to run the country. So, and this will pose a big problem for Syria, because transitional justice is really key. And what about Joulani himself? I don't know if he will be under transitional justice. I mean, so this is an important thing for Tunisia, that we missed that. And for example, the media that were in Tunisia after the revolution were owned by the same people that before the revolution. You know that if you own a media under a dictatorship regime, it means you are working for this dictator. So how can you run media after that? Because there was no transitional justice. This is just an example. And then, as I mentioned, we did strong economic mistakes as hiring people in the public service. We hired thousands of people in the public service to absorb the pressure of the street, and this created a cycle of debt. And we went to the IMF, and we entered in this cycle, increasing salaries, inflation, debt, etc., etc. Because also here another point, maybe at least in the case of Tunisia, it is much more difficult to establish a democracy after a revolution. Maybe it's not the best idea, and I don't know how many democracies were established after a revolution, because the revolution arrived with a certain idea. The young people who did the revolution, I'm not sure that they did it for democracy as per se. Maybe the elites were more, the elite who was westernized and have strong ties with Europe or with the US, fight it for democracy. But the mass population was looking for more social equity, more or better redistribution of the wealth. And if you look to the Arab Spring, even if there are big differences between Tunisia, Egypt, but there are a lot of similarities. The Arab Spring started with an act of humiliation when Mohammed Bouazizi immolated himself in Tunisia. It is kind of rejection of the regime, the corrupted family of Ben Ali or Mubarak, but those people were looking for a better redistribution of the wealth, because Tunisia and Egypt used to grow at 5-6% at the time. There was a growth, but the distribution of this growth was not good. And there was a lot of divide between the east and the west, between the coastal region and the inner area of the country. So I am not sure that those people that went to the street, they learn or know a lot about democracy with all what does it mean. But they were more looking for maybe freedom and more social equity. And this make it much more harder, because it put all governments under huge pressure. The revolution was strong social pressure. There was demonstration in the streets immediately, sit-in, they blocked the phosphate production, they blocked the oil and gas production, so the country found itself with less resources. And this understanding of the revolution was also exacerbated by political parties. Because here I came maybe to the third point, which is the behavior of the political parties and actors, globally speaking. I believe that the rise and the fall of a democracy, first thing is the behavior of political actors, political parties, union, prime minister, presidents, security forces. And in the case of Tunisia, we have many positives examples when the political actors behaved positively allowing this democracy to survive. The army never interfered, for example, in the political game in Tunisia, compared to Egypt, when after 18 months, the army stopped the process. Unions also played a positive role in the beginning in order to balance the political game, but then unions became interfering in the governments and blocking the production, etc. So I think the behavior of political actors is key at the end to decide whether there is a success or a failure in the democracy. So those are maybe quick thoughts. Maybe I will end by saying that democracy is there's a learning curve, for democracy. It's not something that you publish in the official gazette, and it's not something that came overnight, or you just vote on Sunday morning and then you can say, yeah, we consider that we lived under democracy for 10 years. Tunisia was free, fair elections, etc. But then I'm not sure that this is the best example, including for Iraq. I'm not sure that the perception in the Arab street of the democracy in Iraq is positive. Because you need also some quick economic results. You need that people feel and link democracy to their economic and social situation, because you have a lot of forces that are against democracy and that they will play on that now. It's easy to link the bad economic situation with democracy, which is not true. Tunisia, now we are no longer in the democracy and the situation is worse. And no one is demonstrating in the street. But economically, if you look to the numbers and figures, so democracy, there is a learning curve. It needs content to evolve. It needs time. And maybe the hope is that history shows that there are waves of democracy. So maybe the next wave is coming soon for the Arab world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we do have, I think the other lesson is that democracy is fragile. If you put last panel along with our panel, I think that's what maybe we end the first panel too. Democracy is fragile. So we have time for a couple questions. So can anybody?
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Krause. You mentioned that the Israelis have had a lot of elections and chances to go to the polls in a short amount of time. Meanwhile, the Palestinians have not. You cited one election in the 1990s and 2005. I wanted to know if you've had any chance to research as to U.S. efforts into trying to help the Palestinians with their democracy. As certain figures in this room know, when the U.S. wants to help Arab leaders have changes and have elections, they're capable of doing that, as we've seen in my own country in Iraq. So I was wondering, Palestine isn't a state, they're under occupation, they should technically be easier to work with and enforce leadership change. So what were the obstacles behind that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we definitely have people in the room who I'm sure can talk with them about that maybe a little bit later. I'll say a few things. The George W. Bush administration pushed for those elections in 2005, 2006, and then I think we're a bit chastened by the fact that Hamas won, and that was a bit of a surprise. I mean, Khalil Shikaki and other Palestinian pollsters, they recognized the split in Fatah, generationally, and the fact that Fatah was seen as corrupt by a number of Palestinians. But I don't think anyone foresaw that Hamas would win, nearly 2/3 of the seats in the council, and so I think that was a challenge, and I think it gets to the core issue with American democratization efforts in the region in general, and it goes to Professor Alshamary's points and Professor Bailey's points as well, which is the U.S. wants democracy in the region in a general sense, whether you want to make it from the argument of like democratic peace theory or this is living out American values or otherwise, but then the most popular parties or individuals in the Middle East right now are not necessarily going to be pro-American, either because of different values or because of America's behavior in the region, which a lot of people do not, support or approve of. And so Hamas winning those elections, I think, knocked back a lot of American efforts on that level, especially because the U.S. then tried to get Hamas to sign up to the Oslo Accord, didn't do so. Fatah and the Israelis arrested some of the Hamas elected officials. So there have been efforts since then to push the Palestinians towards elections, and the Americans have been part of that. I see a couple obstacles that are still there. Number one, of course, Abu Mazen, the fact that he looks at the polls and realizes he may lose. There's a story that after he lost, or after the previous polls, that he shook his fist and was like, Shikaki, who again, this is Palestinian pollster, told him he was going to win, and as we know, polls aren't always right. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I mean, Abbas is 90 these days? But I would say that, so that there's that challenge, number one, right? Number two, there's the challenge of who gets to vote, because as you mentioned, the Palestinians are geographically dispersed. West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem. That's always a sticking point about whether the Israelis will allow Jerusalemites to vote or not. And Abbas sometimes used that as an excuse to say, oh, we can't have elections unless the Jerusalemites vote. But sometimes it's just a cover for the fact he doesn't want to lose the election. I also think it's fair to say that the Israelis don't necessarily always want the Palestinians to have elections either, because either A, they like the current leadership of the PA, at least prior administrations did. The current ones are defunding the PA and seemingly want them to go away. But it's kind of a game where you need Fatah and Hamas to reconcile and want to have elections. You need the Americans to support the elections. You need the Israelis to support the elections. And then you need not a conflict or something like this going on right now to happen at the same time. So you need all of these elements to kind of line up. And if any one of them doesn't happen, it's like a veto power over the elections actually happening. And so to me, the story of the past 20 years is some combination of all of those things at all different times. And of course, it's more detailed and specific than that, but that would be my general answer.
Take one more. Another question?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can, I don't mean to, I may be sounding naive, but the doctor from Brown Hospital is not allowed into the country, or it's under litigation, because she went to the funeral of a terrorist. Now, is it common? Do the people over there in Lebanon consider it acceptable? Do legitimate people consider it acceptable to go to funerals of terrorists, or agree that it's okay to honor terrorists? I'm wondering is she off the wall, or is she part of the mainstream?
Can I just add two quick final points? One is, if there's a big takeaway from this, you should not look at the Middle East in general, or any individual country, as a unitary whole, right? So building on Professor Alshamary's points, I mean, Lebanon itself is an incredibly divided society. So there are Lebanese who would have the exact perspective that Professor Alshamary was just presenting and regarding folks in southern Lebanon. And there's other Lebanese who would say, Nasrallah is a terrorist, he's the worst guy ever, I don't support him at all. So there's diversity of opinion within the region. And then on your point on terrorism, which again Professor Alshamary raised, like I teach a class on terrorism. The whole first 2 weeks we talk about controversies over the definition of the term and its application. One of the number one issues that's going to be decided right now in the U.S. court system that the Trump administration is challenging is what defines material support for terrorism? Because we have a list of foreign terrorist organizations, Hezbollah is on it, but whereas previously it might be, are you giving money to the organization, are you giving know-how? Now it's, are you putting something on social media, are you going to a funeral? Like, does that rise above the level that if you're a non-citizen that the president or secretary of state could revoke, your residency? I think that's an open question the courts are going to decide, but it goes to exactly your point about how could people perceive this, or how do you think about terrorism? Like, that's the big debate we're going to see right now.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.